for being here, and thanking you as well for providing so much stuff for today, because Chad, you had this merger only for us, for the Italian VMAG, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Vaughn, you did the same with the IPO. Calvin did the same with the split, and well, I mean,
it's all for you.
Yeah, it's all for
all
us.
for you.
Yeah, it's all for us. And probably Duncan has something to say about cloud in VMware and Virtual Stream. What's happening, guys? I mean, every one of you, what are the challenges that you see for the next 1, 2, 3 years, and what are the opportunities that you see with your own companies? So it's up to you.
So if I had to say it in the most simple terms, massive disruption. I think the customers don't understand how much all of the vendor ecosystem are scrambling. If you're a high-tech company, whether you're a leader or not, you should be terrified of all of the stuff that's going on, and also excited, right? So anyone who's an incumbent is under so much threat and under so much pressure all the time that everyone quotes the fact that 82% of the Fortune 500 companies will not be on the Fortune 500 in less than 17 years, right? So I think that we're dealing with a couple of big disruptions. Number one, increasing commoditization of the world of infrastructure. Doesn't mean that there's not innovation. It just means that the point of value is moving towards who can deliver the IaaS outcome. Change in business models. The public clouds are still relatively small, so there's call it a $2 trillion IT market. Azure is about 7 billion and AWS is about 7 billion in revenues, but they're growing at 70-80% CAGRs. So clearly, that's changing the dynamic of the market. I see customers slowing down their adoption of technology because they're not sure what's going on. And then this cloud native stuff is all driven by open source, which messes with all of our traditional business models. So you've got to be disrupting yourself on a ton of different fronts, and we're all doing that in our own ways. But by the way, my comment to everybody here is we're on that journey together. You should never feel scared. You should feel excited. Like, it's always fun to do something new and interesting. So that would be my 2 cents.
No clue what that was about, but anyway, I thought it was a different question. But if you look at it from a VMware perspective, I think in the upcoming 2 to 3 years, what will be most challenging for us is changing the way that we develop our products. If you look at vSphere, for instance, typically there's one release every year and a half. For vSAN, we're trying to do this every 6 months, and there's a good reason for it, because customers are more demanding. They want to have certain aspects of storage being released faster and faster, so that's why we are changing those models. But also from a cultural perspective, that also means that there needs to be a huge shift. Instead of working on something for a year and a half, now you only have literally 3 to 4 months to finish that feature before the next one needs to be started on, and it needs to be QA, tested, end-to-end, you name it. So that's a huge cultural shift within the company itself.
And arguably a lot of it will be open source. I was just going to say, you also have to deal with open source development models.
Yeah, that was my next point. So then there's the open source aspect as well. That's also a big shift within the company. If you look at, we just announced the CNA team. Massimo is one of those guys on that team. And it's a completely different thing than that we've done so far. Although we have a lot of developers on board who traditionally have done a lot of open source, they haven't done it within the company. So that's also a huge cultural change, not just from a cultural perspective, also things like the legal aspects. It's it's a completely different world to go through some of those processes. So it's that's, I think, one of the challenges we'll be facing as a company.
As one of the members in the panel here that has spent a couple years at a startup and had a long tenure at an incumbent vendor prior to that, the difference in terms of the outlook, whether you're an incumbent or a disruptor, is radically different. Chad touched base on it, which is if you're an incumbent, while you're trying to innovate and move forward, you're also trying to desperately hold on to your existing account base. Whereas if you're a disruptor, you're trying to help the customers smooth the transition between what they currently have and put them in a position to be able to have agility to adopt whatever is next in terms of their initiatives. I would add to the points around open source and disruptive and new platforms to say that the technologies that you purchase today also need to introduce new models and new methods. And it's not just as simple as something of saying like, hey, I've got flash technology. It's what are the business models around it? What's you know, are you still in a acquire, depreciate, you know, migrate type of mode, or are you in a more of a subscription-based model? Whether that's you're taking a service and you're taking it off the premise, or are you actually receiving gear in a more subscription-based model today that says as long as I keep subscribing, that the technology is refreshed underneath it. Without making this a pitch, you've seen the impact of flash and all flash into the storage market. But if you actually dig a little deeper beyond the hardware, if you want to be beyond a technologist, but actually take a perspective from a purchaser's perspective, you know, the maintenance models, the refresh, all these cycles that we talked about, it's occurring across the industry. There are models that are in place now, like no capacity-based software licensing, that would have been unheard of 3 years ago. So it's just a dramatic shift, and I think it's really forcing a change on you to how do you quantify or measure value in the platforms that you're bringing aboard. Is that a question? No. Oh, hold up closer. Nobody could hear me.
So it's tough when you're like number 4 because you guys are all covering stuff. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting is being at VMworld this year in Las Vegas. Las Vegas, that's in next year, in San Francisco, is I kind of looked at the landscape of who the storage vendors were that were there. And by my count, there were 34 kind of we'll call startups versus incumbents. There's been a long history of what it takes to make it through that tough grind of getting from startup to being actually make it into being an incumbent. So a couple thoughts that come to mind on that. Number one, Fortune says that about 8% of startups are going to make it. So take those 34 companies and take 8%. That's about 3 companies are going to make it. And that's a pretty low number. So I personally like being an incumbent. I think incumbents have to be agile and we have to do things differently. No doubt about it. But I think startups are going to have a really hard time making it because the cards are stacked against them. I would say that EMC is probably the last of a pure play storage vendor who was able to change the market and become a systems vendor. And they basically did that by buying VMware. Name another storage vendor that's going to become an incumbent, that's going to be a Dell, that's going to be a Hewlett Packard Enterprise, that's going to be an IBM.
Is that a challenge?
It is. Yeah, it is. It is a challenge, so you can take it that way.
Yeah, so I'm glad I'm not in a storage company after that dire future. I'll have to say I agree with a lot of what Chad said around. I still think cloud is the biggest disruptive force right now, whether it's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or even software as a service. I mean, I think that alone puts a lot of pressure on on-premise infrastructure companies. For me, I think that it's going to be the companies that figure out how to embrace those disruptive forces rather than oppose them, who survive kind of the next round of consolidation. So trying to figure out how to embrace Amazon and Azure and how software as a service is changing. And I think Chad's right in the sense that right now, it's very much 2 different worlds. How you manage that infrastructure and how you manage your infrastructure on-prem is very different. And it's going to be the next wave of companies that figures out how to make that a uniform experience, because companies are going to need to know how to navigate both those worlds. Those are the companies that I think will be successful.
Just listening to my respected colleagues. I'm also finding that the pace of change is really gone up a lot. So again, I'm, like all of you and all of you guys, we're practitioners as well as inside our jobs. We're like whoever we work for, but we're studying what our customers are doing. You guys are studying what we're doing. You're studying what the market's doing. I'm just going that the amount of ongoing learning that I've had to do has gone way through the roof. And if I look at if I look at the cloud native ecosystem, it's so fast and furious, and burnout it's so weird, because the OpenStack Summit last year was like, we are going to take over the world. And then this year, the OpenStack Summit in Tokyo was like, I want to go to DockerCon. And then, oh no, DockerCon isn't cool anymore. Now it's MesosCon, right? and like, the reality of it is like, just when something becomes not cool, it's actually becoming important and mainstream. But that ecosystem is moving super, super fast.
So I feel your pain. I think we're actually seeing the hype cycles come much earlier. Much earlier. And everyone's gleaming to what's the next big thing before the technology's actually gotten vetted. The thing that I fear is, I'd hate to be in your shoes. I have no idea how customers choose a technology to invest in. And with all of this innovation, I worry about significant market fragmentation. Investing resources in something that you just are going to pivot away from 6 months later, or has a finite use case. And I'm not trying to say that to be negative, because I'm with you from a perspective of, there's a fair amount of change, but I'm not one of these guys that believes everything, the data center's empty out and everything goes to the cloud. I believe we are in a hybrid model. The customers have a number of tools to get their job accomplished. I think the challenge right now is to figure out which ones can they leverage to the greatest extent, because historically, economics tends to come into play in terms of IT, and when you can leverage a resource for more than one purpose, it tends to have greater value.
So I have a question for you, and I was really surprised by Chad's presentation, because he validated in some way all this SDS thing and the hyperconverge. That's coming from an incumbent. It's something strong, okay, particularly strong. But I'm talking with end users, and I see a lot of new teams now that are dealing with a new kind of infrastructure, and they are totally different teams. They work with the humans and not more boxes. They work with the skills. They work with the open source. So how do you feel that? Because you are not I can say you are not the person that they call if they have a problem, if they want to do something new. So you are already dealing with P1, P2, probably some of the P3, but the P3, P4, it's not no longer there.
So this is a bad analogy, but it's an analogy. So amongst the SE workforce at EMC, there's roughly around 3,400 brothers and sisters of mine. So my SE family, right? And it used to be that you'd have roughly 3,000 people who were a primary storage person. They would know storage, and that was their thing. And then there'd be, 1,500 people who would be like a specialist in one thing or another. If I look at it now, it's about 2,000 people that are, now generalists. And the people, like, they're architects. They're this weird new horizontal role. And we have more specialists that back them. If I think about what that then means, and you can see this, by the way, VMware is going through this huge transition where they've got more and more specialists within their functions, and then you place a load on people that are generalists to be able to architect systems and solutions that are very horizontal. I see that echoing inside the customer base. Like the day where you would have like a storage team and a network team and a virtualization team, and it's kind of done. Some people haven't gotten the memo yet. You know what I mean? Like sometimes they still think that they can still sustain that model, but they're not going to make it. I think that the role of the generalist is becoming increasingly important. And if you don't like the word generalist because it implies bad at everything, you can think of it more as architect, right? People who have got horizontal skill.
So I spoke to this in my session, and I wanted to ask you and everyone on the panel if they're seeing this, but I believe that we're seeing a greater merging between the compute and the storage teams. The networking team is still, I think, has a very distinctly different skill set that's keeping them unique. And I think part of what's fueling that merger is technological advances like software-defined storage or these next-generation storage platforms that are significantly simpler than in the past, and it's allowing those two teams to merge.
The weird thing, though, is that if you look at an actual cloud service provider, or if you're looking at the service part of an advanced telco that's doing NFV or stuff like that, that more advanced stuff at Telefonica or whatever, the networking teams do merge in. Within your enterprise, you're dead right. Like the enterprise, the networking team's still on the side. I don't think that that's intrinsic. I think that wall will fall.
Do you have any more questions?
Nothing to add.
Next question.
No, I'd like to grab your.
Thank you.
It's a party.
Wow. No, your thoughts about the change of pace, which by the way was mentioned this morning by Mariano. So the fact that is going fast, change is becoming has always been there, but it's becoming damn fast. And the fact that you in VMware, for example, see it as a challenge and an opportunity to shorten release cycles, stuff like that. That means that customers need to do the same because they're asking for it, and as soon as you get products that fast, they are going to implement it. So do you really see that your customers are ready for this pace of change, or just demanding for it but actually not ready for it?
I think we can ask the question to the audience. How many people would like to upgrade their storage system once a week? Not too many people. Who would like to do Windows patches every day? Not too many people. And there's a reason for it. It's not just the people who are probably not ready for it. The technology isn't ready for it in the majority of cases. Okay, there are a couple of vendors have these single-click updates and you name it, which all sounds great. But there's also, to every single time you do an update or a patch, there's a risk associated with it. And can you take that risk every single day? A company like Amazon can do it because they have their whole model actually built on that particular technology and that architecture. That's the way they drive their business. But for the majority of enterprise customers, that's not their core business. Their core business today isn't IT. Maybe that will change in the future. That will probably change in the future. Actually, it should change in the future if they still want to exist 5 years from now. But that's going to be an evolution, so that's going to take multiple years. It means that we, from a VMware perspective, will need to change. Things will need to be easier to adopt. Things will need to be easy to upgrade and patch, and you name it. But the same applies to you as a customer. There will need to be a lot of changes internally before you can take that next step. As we just said, have the different teams not working together today. I always see the big gaps between the virtualization team and the networking team and the security teams. You can't move to a model like this where you're making changes every day or changes every hour unless you guys sit in the same room and actually discuss what kind of changes you are making and it's well planned out. It's a very complex process.
Yeah, but on that same line, as you're seeing your company, EMC, our company, I'm sure HP as well, you're seeing a significant amount of engineering effort be put in place in terms of raising the intelligence within the systems. Maybe saying self-healing is maybe going too far, but adding a significant amount of capability in the system so that they can be upgraded online, so that they can be more predictive in addressing or identifying a problem, making the change an effortless or an impact-less type of update where you would have never thought about it in the past because it would have been outages or detrimental to the business. I think the market has shifted. The customers are expecting no-touch systems. And I think modern platforms are significantly further ahead of that path than legacy platforms.
I think that basically the battleground between, Dell EMC, HP Enterprise, Hewlett Packard Enterprise. Thanks. I don't even know what DMC is going to be called, right? And Cisco's going to have to do some stuff too, for sure. I think that the answer for simplification is going to force customers to make choices where the definition of convergence is going to move further up the stack. So if you think about what VMware's trying to do with the Evo SDDC suite, making things easier to deploy and upgrade and patch and use, you guys are doing great stuff in storage systems to make them simpler and so on and so forth. I actually think that basically people are going to go, I want to have an AWS level of simplicity, which, by the way, means by definition, you will all have to get over the term lock-in. So I know that that's, every choice that you make in IT is a form of lock-in. What people are starting to realize is that the trade-offs of build versus consume has pivoted further up stack. Not always, I'm not saying it's black and white, but in general, the customers I'm seeing are like, I just need a freaking easy button. And for some of them, maybe it looks like something that's like an Evo Rail vSpecs Blue type thing. For others, it might look like a HP Helion on a converged infrastructure stack. I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Calvin, but it might be something like a VX rack with an Evo SDDC, but they're buying IaaS. They're not buying components at all anymore. And frankly, I'm seeing SEs and sales teams and partners that don't understand that the value is shifted up as like going, I don't understand what's happening anymore, but the customer doesn't want the components. They want a higher level piece. They want the components to be good though,
Kind of going back to something that Vaughn said before about how he kind of feels for customers, and I think it plays into kind of the question that you're asking from my point of perspective. I feel really bad for customers. I mean, the number of choices that you have when making decisions is overwhelming. I mean, me as a vendor, I actually don't pay attention to probably 80% of my competition. I don't have time to figure out what they're doing. I don't. And I'm not really focused on competitive stuff anyway, but as a customer, I think about what you are facing, one thing that I see a lot, especially from smaller accounts like SMBs, and I think there's obviously large businesses in Italy, but I suspect there's a lot that are smaller kind of companies. And I see so many customers that walk into needing something that they haven't actually defined what their objectives are, is they walk into something and they're like, I need a SAN. Like, wait a minute, let's step back a minute. How many servers do you have? Oh, we have 2 hosts and we've got 8 VMs. What do you need a SAN for? and so I think what I think about is what I think would make at least a good start to run it in the right direction is to make sure you're defining what you're trying to achieve from a requirement standpoint, because I see a lot of smaller customers that go out and they've already decided I need this hardware or I need this solution, I'm going to go get it, instead of actually defining what the business need is.
So
I think the technology that's in our pockets and now part of our everyday lives is actually starting to shift what's expected from you in delivering IT services. We could call it or classify it as the consumerization of IT, and I think Chad is right. The majority of your customer engagements, whether it's company-wide or department-wide, I'm either going to move something to the cloud, or the IT team is saying, if we don't have cloud-like services, we're not going to be in business anymore. And again, it's more usually department by department or app by app. For example, when you get into the cloud, right, SaaS models tend to be hugely successful, right? Salesforce.com, payroll services, HR services. These, I think, are easy to adopt because the IT department can do a risk assessment. They understand the information that's going into the service, right? And they can quantify the risk. I think IaaS is a little more open-ended, right? It's a little bit more Pandora's box. Maybe it doesn't have the same momentum. But those who are gravitating towards IaaS or PaaS tend to seek agility that they're not finding on premises. I think as well as IT staffs are now looking around this consumerization model saying, I need to be cost competitive with the external service offerings. It's not about saying that IT is not what the company's in business for. I think if you are a modern vendor, you are an IT vendor. Right? The whole Internet of Things means no matter what product you sell, a refrigerator or a car, it's connected to the internet. IT is part of your business. It's just, are you going to manage the infrastructure piece? And you are managing infrastructure, even if it's from a cloud service provider. It's just, what level of depth are you going to manage? But again, consumerization is the new focus, and that's where you should be looking at any technologies that you're going to adopt. How do they fit into your consumerization model?
So I have a quick question, because you told us 2 years ago was OpenStack, then everything was containers, and then Mesos. What's up next, from your point of view, from the discussion that you have with customers today?
So this is going to sound totally dorky.
Mainframes.
So yeah,
Again.
mainframes. It's all coming back to the mainframe, baby. Doesn't IBM wish? So look, we will crack this ecosystem and others. We will crack the code of making delivering a full-blown hybrid IaaS much easier than it is today. That's for sure. And we're all running down that path and making good progress. The abstraction layer for cloud-native apps is going to be containers. It's not going to be VMs, period, full stop. And at VMworld this year, it was great to see Kit and Ray O'Farrell, the CTO, make the pivot to go acknowledge, yep, these are two different universes. But what's next? If everyone goes Internet of Things to me is a very large-scale big data dialogue, right? It's just very large-scale, lots of machine data. The thing that I think is really, really going to be disruptive is large-scale in-memory databases. And while this sounds very niche-y, right? If you think about it, the entire application world ultimately has an app that sits on something that persists the data, and the persisting data isn't storage. It's the thing above the storage layer. It's a relational database, it's Oracle, it's SQL Server, or it's this weird new stuff. It's MapReduce, it's Spark or whatever, right? When Cloudera, who was a leader in the traditional Hadoop ecosystem, said, I'm going to pivot everything towards Apache Spark, that was a really big deal. The reason that that's just really important is in the same way that Flash, NAND revolutionized the world of transactional storage, the world of transactional storage ultimately powers things that are transactional, which are VMs or databases. For the most part, I'm oversimplifying, but the real question is what happens if the database just completely goes away and is displaced by something that's in memory? I think that over the next 2-3 years, we're going to see some really funky stuff there. And that'll change the world because it'll allow people to build whole new apps in whole new ways.
I'm going to pick something from the infrastructure layer itself. I think one of the industries, or at least one of the sections that's ready for change, is the backup and recovery market. I don't know if anyone is still using virtual tape libraries at this point in time. You see some hands? Still a couple of people. It's one of those things that really hasn't changed. The backup industry hasn't really changed for the last 25 years, more so. There's now about 2 or 3 startups doing something new in this space. So Cohesity, Rubrik, Activio, new startups changing the world of backup and recovery, not just backup and recovery, also replication. It's more data copy management that actually is backup and recovery. And I think that's one of those places where we can expect to see a lot of changes. Well, it'd be moving data to a different platform, and then you can start doing smart stuff with the data, whether that's backing up, recovering the data, running analysis on top of that data, spinning off new copies of the data that you can use for your test dev environment. It could be all of that. But I think that's one of those areas within IT that needs to change drastically because it hasn't changed for a long, long time.
So just to help understand, do you also see more sysadmin becoming developers? Because also doing analytics and that kind of stuff, you need a new kind of skill on top of that.
That's one of those things that people have been talking about for the last 2 years. Every single sysadmin needs to become a developer. Everyone needs to be capable of doing Python. Everyone needs to be capable of doing C++ or whatever it is. So how many people of you actually know how to develop code? Just a couple of hands are going up. Why? Because it's a very specific skill set. It requires a very specific mindset as well. Typically, most of the admins that I know, they are developers. They don't have the skill set. They don't even know where to start. Writing a Perl script or something with Power CLI, sure, but that's not coding. It's on a completely different level. So okay. I wouldn't expect that to change drastically. Yeah, sure, your tasks will change and you will be more doing around automation, orchestration, you name it. Has got nothing to do with pure coding, in my opinion.
As we started to get more and more into the open source world over the last year, we basically had to build a whole new set of people in the team because we had no DNA for that world, right? And now, a year and change into it, stuff's popping up, GitHub repos, projects, et cetera, et cetera. I totally agree with you, you don't have to be a developer. I do think that one of the things that characterizes that whole model is people get confused saying, does DevOps mean that the developers will operate the infrastructure? No, it does not. Does DevOps mean that the operators are developers? No, it does not. But what it means is that the developers write code thinking about how that code will operate, and the people who are the operators think about how people who are developers want to consume code. Therefore, the point of saying you don't have to become a developer if you're an infrastructure layer expert, but I really would encourage people to learn some skills around infrastructure as code level functions. You know what I mean? It doesn't mean that you have to become someone who's an expert developer.
I've just added that a few startups are already developing some kind of query languages for their storage, for their networking stuff, and so it's not that you need to become a developer, but you already writing scripts and you add in that script some logic, some more logic. Okay.
Yeah,
That's
so remember the conversation point earlier about the hype cycle getting faster and faster? So yes, there are some arrays that allow you to do some scripting language on the back end, some what you may call big data-like analytic queries. I still think that's going to be a skill set that's got to be developed. I think the jury's still out whether that level of logic is going to be inherent within the storage arrays, and it may be. It may be probably better suited when it's available through APIs. You know, what you tend to look at when technologies hit massive scale, they tend to be able to leverage some form of simplicity for mass adoption. Look, I don't think anyone in this room would challenge whether OpenStack is a tremendously capable set of technologies. You know, what hinders its adoption? The complexity, right? You either hire the folks to take the complexity out of your individual deployments, or you purchase simplicity. And every organization has some mix between what they're willing to take on themselves and what they're willing to pay for, because they don't have the time to go figure out that there's value in whatever that task may be. I think that's always an ebb and flow. And so coming back around, just so that the rest of the panel can go back to the point that I think you were making, which is you were seeking future trends. I think we'll see flash storage, and I've said this before, I said in my session earlier, I think we'll see flash storage hit the capacity-based market in grand scale starting 2016. You know, you're talking sub-dollar a gigabyte capacities. I think that radically changes the amount of volume that customers can put in a data center. You will start measuring storage in terms of watts per gigabyte, gigabytes per rack unit, and petabytes per administrator. I think, again, none of this happens unless it can be simplified and connected on a more programmatic type of interface defined by service levels. But I think when you move to memory structures, you have that capability. I think other technologies that we've seen that were very server-based in their notion, like Hadoop-based constructs with DAS-based architectures. I think that's already happening in market today, which is the largest of those largest installs are moving back to shared storage models, right? So there's always this tick-tock in terms of the evolution of architectures, from working within an x86 platform to, at scale, what's the better means to have them operate. So I don't think everything necessarily goes to a distributed architecture. I think it's an exciting time to be in technology. I think right now maybe the worst thing you can do is dig your heels in and say there's going to be one model that moves forward. I think you're going to be best set to try to understand the strengths of various models.
Yeah, some quick input on the development side. Like if you want to get into development, to me, I'm not a big fan of any domain-specific query languages and stuff like that. I don't think that's ever really rooted itself well with some of the new technologies. The way that everything is headed, or that everything has been headed, the best skill for an admin to have today is to understand how to program against web services. So, you know, whether it's Amazon, I mean, Amazon didn't used to have an API, didn't used to have a UI, a web-based UI. You used to have to know how to call a web-based service to actually deploy a machine or, you know,
Okay.
deploy an S3 object store. It's going to be the same way as we move to the Internet of Things. These are cell phones, everything, I mean, all of these devices are going to have web-based services that aren't language specific, that you can access with any language that you know. So if you're just getting into development and want to get into automation, to me the first skill that you should pick up is how to program against a web-based service, period.